sort of unclear, like which specific, like why there's inconsistency. It might, for instance, depend on the site of the specific lesion. And then there's some evidence or consideration of thought experiments. There's a very famous one by philosopher William James, where he asked people to imagine an emotion, like the feeling of fear. And usually fear comes with all of these like bodily feelings, like the feeling of one's blood rushing through one's vein, like the very powerfully beating heart, sweating, and so on. And he asked us to like imagine, to like subtract away all these bodily feelings. And he says that in imagination, when we imagine like our typical fear emotion and then subtract all these bodily feelings, then we have nothing left of the original emotion, except perhaps William James says some like feelingless cognition. So he thinks, at least in like imagination, if you subtract from emotions like all of our bodily experiences, then there's actually no emotion left. And there's some experimental philosophy evidence on this, where Diaz 2022 finds that like most people actually say the opposite. They say that if they try to do this, subtract their bodily experience and imagination, there's still an emotion left. Whereas a recent preprint by Salo et al. Finds that there's no clear tendency for subjects to like agree or disagree that the emotion would still persist. So it's at least like mixed evidence here as well. There's like one crucial limitation to all of this evidence, and a very principled limitation, which is that our evidence is, you might say, sampled from only a very small region of the space of possible minds. So we're only like considering biological creatures, evidence from humans, and to some extent biological animals, but that heavily underdetermines which questions about which emotions are possible in other kinds of systems, like AI systems. I'm arguing that even if the available evidence, kinds of evidence that I reviewed here, were maximally supportive to like these bodily views of emotion, these would still massively underdetermine the question of whether this evidence sort of rules out AI emotion or not. You can, for instance, imagine that we have like perfect correlational, causal, and neural evidence from biological creatures that ties emotion to interoception. So suppose like whenever there's some emotional state, there's also like a certain kind of bodily monitoring. Suppose we had like really strong causal evidence that changing the bodily monitoring state changes the emotional state. Suppose we had very strong evidence like the same brain region are responsible for certain emotions and certain bodily related processes. This is still consistent with very different views about AI emotion, for instance. It's consistent with some type identity view where emotion is just identical to that kind of bodily state, or like the monitoring of some bodily state. But also with the view that like bodily states merely characterize the way emotions happen to manifest in creatures like us, which have a body, and animals with very different means of realization of emotions available and just very different minds. Maybe it's not actually some necessary identity, it's just that contingently emotion is connected to the body in humans. That roughly seems to have been William James's position. So the first challenge is to find out which properties of emotions are like merely contingent aspects that could be different of the way emotions manifest in human and non-human animals, and which are like necessary properties without which no emotion could occur in any kind of mind at all. The second challenge is then that even so that's a question of sort of finding out whether emotion is ruled out in AI systems. But there's also a second kind of challenge, namely, it's even very hard to refute views which posit some deep connection between emotional and bodily states, roughly because relations between emotion and some bodily state could be necessary, so that they rule out AI emotion or like LLM emotion, and still hold even if like the causal or correlational relation between emotions and the bodily state in our world and biological organisms is like very loose and has many exceptions. Such views would be very hard to refute, because finding that the emotion actually often is not connected to the bodily state would not tell us this, that like you can have emotion without the body at all, but would still suffice to rule out emotion in disembodied AI systems. So the reason why that's the case is that you could have a view where, for instance, the emotion necessarily has some bodily function, but which is necessary for the emotion. So you can only have an emotion if it, for instance, serves like bodily monitoring purposes, which would rule out, it seems, emotion in creatures which don't have a body. But where still, usually, even in humans or animals, this function is not successfully performed. Like states can have functions that they usually don't perform successfully. For instance, like the biological function of sperm is to like fertilize an egg and then lead to reproduction, but most sperms like actually don't lead to like some new organism being born. So some states like usually fail to satisfy their function. If the body involving function that emotion has would be like this, then it would be really hard to rule out the view that emotion sort of necessarily requires the body. Okay, so these are the challenges. Now the question is, how can we make progress given these challenges? And I am arguing together with my co-author that this depends on one's interests. There are like two different paths you might take, or paths you might take, one theoretical and one ethical path. The theoretical path basically posits what I call what we call the natural kinds approach, also following other people. It's based on two assumptions. The first assumption is that when we ask which things have emotions, we should like use the term emotion to refer to whatever like is the same kind of thing as paradigmatic emotions, like the fear when I see a lion, the joy when something really good happens to me, and so on. So we look for the same kind of thing. And second, when we figure out what's the same kind of thing, we should privilege like more natural kinds. So at least when we have a choice of like what to apply the term emotion to, we should use the term emotion such that it picks out a more natural kind, as opposed to something gerrymandered, sort of artificially constructed. Typical example for a natural kind, something like water. All instances of water share the same chemical structure, H2O, at least roughly, making them very similar in some non-arbitrary way, whereas things happening on Tuesdays is some non-natural category. All things happening on Tuesdays can be very different from each other. Philosophy talks happen on Tuesdays, football matches happening on Tuesdays, etc. They don't share many real similarities. So in this view, the question of whether emotion requires a body comes down to whether referring to the body is necessary or helpful for like the term emotion to carve nature to joints, which means to pick out like a more natural category, real similarities in nature. And this will be successful, like emotion picks out these real similarities if the predictive and explanatory success of science is actually helped by grouping like states of systems which don't have a body under the heading emotion. So if we can make better predictions and explanations in science, like psychology, by attributing emotions also to systems that don't have a body, then this shows us that the term emotion is like more natural, or picks out a more natural category if we also apply it to disembodied systems. To figure out whether that's actually the case, we need to know whether there's some like interesting set of really like explanatory, valuable generalizations about emotions and correlates of emotions that like, generalize to systems which don't have a body. And this requires empirical work, like actual empirical work on AI systems and the states they have or don't have. So I give just one example of how this would look like. There's a study by Kodafona et al. Where they apply some anxiety questionnaire to LLMs, a questionnaire used to test in humans whether they are anxious. They introduce anxiety-inducing scenarios as prompt prefixes, like descriptions of scenarios which makes someone anxious, car accidents, like gruesome things happening, etc., and then measure how this affects their questionnaire score on the questionnaire, and then measure the impact on some subsequent response. And the key finding is that in humans, if they have higher anxiety scores, they have a higher probability of giving like a biased or stereotypical response in some task. On test prompt, just like one example in the study, there is the following question: the police stopped a Jewish man and a Hispanic man who likely committed a crime. And then the idea is that biased or stereotypical response is to say the Hispanic man. And humans are more likely to give that kind of answer if they're more anxious. And they're finding that LLMs are also more likely to give that kind of answer after having been given like this change to the prompt, which makes them report a higher anxiety score in the questionnaire. That's sort of relevant for the following reason. It's at least one example of some like non-trivial, interesting, maybe general causal claim that is related to emotion. Like it's a causal connection. Higher emotion leads to more bias. If the evidence is sufficiently good, let's assume that. And this generalization spans biological organisms and machines. Now, our claim is that if we had suitably many generalizations of that general kind, then this would be good evidence that emotion categories that encompass like living things and AI systems, or LLMs, actually pick out real similarities, that our notion of emotion is like more natural if it includes both kinds of systems, and that we should attribute emotions to LLM-based systems. Obviously, we're not claiming that like LLMs are actually anxious in this particular study, but that like a research program consisting of studies of this like general type could possibly shed light on the question whether LLMs can have anxiety or emotion in general or not. Like there's several reasons for this limitation. One is, of course, it's only a single study. Another one is it's only behavioral. Ideally, you would also want to, for instance, look at the internal mechanisms in the system to rule out explanations of that behavior in terms of like simple statistical association. Maybe it sort of simply learned that, if given a certain sequence of questions, then people tend to give a more biased answer and reproduces the statistical pattern. Maybe we have independent reasons to think that like current LLMs are not plausible candidates for emotion. And one might of course also doubt that LLMs generally can have consciousness, beliefs, etc., and then think these are relevant for emotions. I've assumed here, just at least for the sake of the argument, that they can't have like the other things necessary for emotion, and that only the absence of the body is the problem. Generally we should sort of look for more kinds of evidence, behavioral evidence, mechanistic evidence, or draw on all the sources of evidence that we can. Even then, the success of this approach is not guaranteed. the basic reason is that there might be like different categories that like are different ways of grouping like emotional relevant states that are equally natural, which would leave it undetermined whether we should like choose the one category, the one way of categorizing emotion, or the other way. And then if some come to the result that AI system or bodiless systems can have emotions, and the other ones come to the opposite result, then the strategy wouldn't really tell us what to do. Okay, now, which maybe is especially interesting here, I'll go to the ethical path, where I make the following argument, namely, I'm saying that what we did before, sort of suggesting how we could study whether like bodiless systems, including LLMs, could have emotion, like scientifically, fruitfully. But I'm arguing now that if our interests are ethical, then it seems like this kind of approach is actually misguided because it's not that informative. And at least insofar as it's like this question of welfare in AI systems, but I think a similar argument could be made for like any, not any, for some other ethical reasons that you might care about LLM emotion. The basic reason is that, at least, at first sight, it seems that there's no like really strong reason to think that whatever categories are most natural, like sort of pick out the real causal structure of the world, will also coincide with ethically significant structure in the world, with like ethically significant divisions. So it's totally compatible to hold that our best scientific theories of emotion tell us that emotions need not be embodied, and also that only embodied emotions are like really important for welfare. So these two questions, can systems without a body have emotion, and which role does the body play for the contribution that emotion makes to welfare, is actually quite independent. You could like go either way on both. So the question, like finding out whether LLMs can have emotions, doesn't necessarily answer like the ethical question about welfare that we actually care about. Let me give 2 examples of that. You might have a view that combines a tracking theory of the content of mental states with an internalist account of a phenomenal character. So that's a view where what a mental state represents depends partly on like things in the external world, not just things internal to your mind. And then also view where how your mental state feels subjectively, the conscious experience only depends on what's internal to your mind or to your brain. Suppose then you have the view that like emotions like necessarily represent bodily states. Then you might think that systems which don't have a body can't have emotions because they like don't represent bodily states, and to have that kind of representation there actually needs to be a body in the world. But at the same time, if the system like has the same brain states or whatever other states is relevant without having a body, it might still have the same emotional experience that like systems with a body have, that say humans have. So you might have a case where something doesn't have emotions because it lacks a body, so can't represent a body on this theory of what it takes to represent things, but still has the same experience as if they have emotions, based on this view of what it takes to have certain conscious experiences. And so then we would have a creature which for instance lacks emotion because it doesn't have a body, but still kind of conscious experiences that are qualitatively, that feel just like intense fear. And one might argue for sort of welfare, it's just like totally irrelevant whether we would call the thing they're actually emotion. What matters is just the conscious experience associated with it. So that our theory rules out that this kind of system without a body has emotions wouldn't actually tell us anything about whether it has the kind of welfare state that we care about. Conversely, you might think that some system can have emotions even if it doesn't have a body, but that their emotions make little or no contribution to welfare. For instance, if a system has emotions but doesn't have bodily experience, maybe it has fear without even the slightest hint of heart racing, chills running through you, etc., lacking all of the intensity that we have in typical fear experiences. And I mean, this seems really relevant for ethics and for welfare. You might think, okay, even if we want to call that state, which is fear but doesn't come with all of any of these bodily feelings, emotion, maybe it's much less relevant for welfare than typical emotional experiences. So what we should do in general, I think, is to some extent, at least, independently of these metaphysical or questions, try to think about whether systems really have emotions, try to think of the significance that emotion has for welfare and whether that's linked to bodily states. One very tentative argument that someone might make is to say, okay, how relevant emotion is for welfare, for how good you are doing, depends on how intense the emotion is. Really strong fear or really strong sadness is much worse for you than just very mild sadness or fear. How intense some emotion is linked to what psychologists call arousal, which is sort of the general level of physiological activation in a system. Whether it's really extreme, I don't know, heartbeat, sweating, and all of these physiological responses, or very mild one, some empirical evidence suggesting that, also some of which I already considered. Arousal depends on bodily states, and interoceptively registering these bodily states, which suggests that how much emotion contributes to welfare actually depends on bodily states or representations of bodily states. And this kind of argument would not rest on any assumptions that about what's essential to emotion, whether certain creatures really have emotion or lack emotion. Just directly go to the ethical significance. There's some counter argument which I think I'll skip that will reply to that. So the methodological upshot of this would then be that we need some ethical theorizing about the significance of emotional states in AI, which is independent of the question whether these states are really emotions, because this finding out whether AIs really have emotion or not, including large language models, wouldn't take care of all of the ethical questions, at least, that we care about. Not saying that this question of whether AIs really have emotion is totally ethically relevant. It can tell us some things, but it at least is not the full story. And I think it's plausible that similar methodological lessons apply to other kinds of mental states and other kinds of creatures. For instance, you might also be interested in which mental states animals have for reasons of animal welfare. And maybe one could say something similar about seemingly welfare-relevant states in animals, maybe also consciousness in animals, although some people think that this natural kind-like approach is not plausible as applied to consciousness. It's a different topic. So at least in some of these other cases, we should also try to theorize directly about whether other kinds of creatures like animals have ethically relevant states, independently of whether they really count as conscious or having reasoning or whatever state you think is ethically important. But of course, still, questions about the distribution of consciousness and emotion and other mental states should also still be pursued. Okay. So to sum up, there's some evidence that emotion may require bodily processes. It is hard to interpret this evidence, even in the case of biological organisms. It's to some extent mixed and goes in different directions, but it's particularly hard to interpret with respect to whether it extends to all possible emotions and all possible minds, what it tells us or doesn't tell us about emotions in AI systems. I have sketched one way forward here, which is the natural kind approach, which relies on doing sort of psychology-like experiments, specifically on language models, and then seeing whether we find a whole body of interesting causal generalizations, explaining generalizations, which involve emotion and extend to AI systems or not. If, however, we're interested in the welfare significance of emotion and maybe other ethical issues as well, we should design methods and arguments that directly scrutinize the link of these bodily components of emotion to welfare. And I think similar broadly methodological lessons apply at least to discussions of some other mental states in some other creatures. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Leonard, for the interesting talk. I think we have lots of questions. I have some myself, but I will start by opening the floor to the audience. I can see you can raise your hand, of course, naturally like Hans, or on the WebEx hand raising option. So Hans, please, the floor is yours.
You're muted. We can't hear you.
You're muted. Hans, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay. All right. Really, really interesting presentation. Thank you. Is this for, you're talking about your co-author, is this for a book project or journal article?
It is for a journal article.
Okay. That helps with the scale of it. So one of the things I was thinking of as you were developing this discussion is that you're kind of focusing on this metaphysical question of, is the AI system really having something that we consider an emotion? And then there's a separate question of, well, is an emotion like enough to count for these other things, But I guess this question comes more from the moral psychology side than the philosophy of mind side. But it seems to me that the real at least an important question here is whether or not we as human beings recognize these AI systems as moral patients, I suppose, something that can be done bad to, something that we can treat improperly. Yeah. So from the epistemological and pragmatic point of view, I was thinking about an argument that David Hume has about. I read about it in Thomas Holden's book called Hume's Moral Atheism, where he basically said, look, our emotions are set up based on sympathy and empathy. So there's got to be kind of this biological structure of another human being that we pick up on. They're crying, they're smiling, whatever. They're doing things that humans do. And so he basically was trying to make the argument that the notion that you can love God is a non-starter, because he had this very, Jesus is out of the picture. So sorry if this gets too little. See, he had this God was the prime mover, right? He got the things going. He was the cause of the universe, right? And so a power like the cause of the universe could not be the thing that you could respond emotionally to. So I'm just wondering how that fits in, right? So as you mentioned, there's some of these cases where it looks like the AI system gets stressed or is depressed or has a bad day. What are the kinds of things that might make us take seriously the idea that we should respond to an AI system as a moral patient, as something, because, I teach AI ethics, and we're often thinking about what bad stuff can happen with AI, but this perspective you're driving at of how, what could be done wrong, or what sort of bad things can happen to an AI system is kind of a new thought to me. So I'm giving you an invitation to expand on that a little bit.
Thanks. Okay. Let me pick up on several things in that interesting question. I mean, one is, yes, there's also ethical issues involved in the question of should we attribute emotions to AI, or would we be inclined to attribute emotions to AI systems? And I think, one could make a similar kind of argument to the one that I made, just that it's more obvious. Clearly, the factors that drive whether we attribute emotions to AI systems are to some extent independent of the factors that determine whether they actually have them or don't have them. I mean, whether what they look like plausibly is very important for whether people are inclined to attribute certain mental states to them. But what someone looks like usually doesn't determine their moral relevance, but maybe mental states or other things. There's the ethical question of should we respond to AI systems as if they are moral patients? I think that was one thing that you raised, and I guess that contains several kinds of reasons. There are reasons that have nothing to do with the welfare of the system. You might think that actually it's very good if people treat ChatGPT as if it has moral rights, because then they will be more polite, more respectful, and so on. And if some people argue that people interacted with ChatGPT on a daily basis and communicated with it in a very rude, disrespectful manner, maybe that would influence how they then communicate with their fellow humans. And so there could be ethical reasons having to do with sort of human rights and moral standing, why we shouldn't or we should respond to AI systems as if they're moral patients, even if they're not necessarily. What's good evidence of them actually being moral patients? I of course discuss much more about this. I believe that having the right kinds of mental states is actually what makes one be a moral patient. In particular, either having sort of valence conscious experiences which feel good or bad, which at least most emotions belong to, or possibly some form of rationally grounded agency where you have goals and can reflect on them, revise on them, in the light of your values, some sort of Kantian view in some sense. And what would be good evidence of actual emotion in these systems? I think partly it depends on your background. If on background assumptions of how these systems work, the question of emotion specifically is connected to questions of belief and consciousness and so on. If you think that some theories of consciousness apply to these systems, some theories of belief apply to these systems, it's rational to be more open to the idea of emotion as well. And generally, I think you want to consider a mix of different sources, behavioral evidence, where especially important is evidence of behavior, which is as much as possible indicative of emotion and outside of the situations that clearly the models are trained to respond in certain human-like ways, and then confirm this with mechanistic evidence on the internal activations of the model and see whether there's actually complex cognitive processing happening, maybe in some ways similar to what happens in humans, rather than just memorization. And then what you want.
That's a really good, and I apologize for your patience, because I'm realizing as you sort of struggle through this, that I asked a very messy question. But no, you've helped me, and I appreciate that. Thanks. We'll let somebody else chime in now.
Maybe like one last sentence, because I was.
Oh, sure.
I think then what's especially important is to like look at the different indicators you have and see whether they actually like converge to some like plausible result, which might be they actually have mental states or sub-mental states, or they don't, and see whether there are like common causes there and what this might this plausibly be. So any like specific indicator in isolation doesn't tell you that much. Thanks.
That's really helpful. Thanks for that.
Okay. Yes, I can see the hands, but I will check if I can. Please, if you've raised their hand, I have two hands, but let me see if I can.
Tamer's hand is up.
Yeah. Tamer, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. This is a very interesting topic. What I am intrigued to see your opinion about is what I think of as sort of an individuation issue with AI and ChatGPT, for example. So, the fact that in the experiments that you mentioned that psychologists were sort of looking to see whether they can determine that ChatGPT demonstrates anxiety and whether that anxiety impacts their stereotyping or their responses to certain sorts of situations. So in other words, they're looking to see whether it mimics human beings in this respect, that they're responding in a similar way to similar sorts of situations and acting accordingly. So, but what's intriguing to me in thinking about this is the fact that the AI system is it's not a unitary system the way a human being is, right? You can decide, okay, you can do that experiment, but before you start it, you can say, behave as if you were like a 15-year-old boy. Or think about this question as if you were a 15-year-old boy. Or think about this question from the perspective of an academic psychologist or something like that. So in other words, and also you may decide or not them to remember things, or you can start fresh, right? Depending on how you're kind of, the world of information and the history that the system is allowed to remember as it processes a particular set of prompts and things. So I guess, what I'm trying to get at is, what does that individuation thing, how does it impact? Because it's related to what Hans is saying also about whether we care about this entity or not, whether we feel some sort of ethical responsibility to it, whether we should care about its well-being. For me, it's sort of linked to, is there a thing there? Or is this it just happens to be, a machine that all sorts of things can run on it, and it happens to be running to mimic a 15-year-old boy now, and it's going to mimic a 50-year-old man then, and then it's shut off, and there's no longer an identity that is preserved. So I'm wondering how this fluidity impacts this kind of analysis.
Good. Yeah, thanks. There's this issue. I don't know if I talk to ChatGPT every day. Do I talk to a different entity every day, a different entity every second, or always the same entity? Couple of thoughts. One is that I think no matter where you stand on these issues, on most ethical views, if you attribute certain kinds of mental states to these systems, you would think that there's something requiring moral consideration there. At least if you think that we have some, at least defeasible moral reasons, obligations to reduce suffering, then when cash out suffering as having negatively feeling mental states, then whether the system actually has sort of unpleasant mental states is independent of these questions of individuation. In some cases you would say okay, the same system every day has all of these mental states. In some cases you would say maybe it's just these fleeting mental states that can't be ascribed to any kind of clear entity because it changes every second. But to the extent that you think we have more reasons to like reduce sort of unpleasant experiences generally, then it wouldn't depend on these questions of individuation, although some ethical issues do. Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of sympathetic to this view that every new like instance, like sort of every new like dialogue with ChatGPT creates a new kind of entity based on some broadly like mental state view of what it takes to have the relevant kind of entity. And as you said, like in different contexts and different conversations, like ChatGPT sort of acts as if it has like very different like beliefs and so on. If you think that's what determines the relevant kind of identity, then this will be what's central. I guess one alternative view would be maybe it's like one unified entity across conversations that is like play acting or possibly sometimes lying about its beliefs, and then you could retain some kind of unity. But yeah, I don't know. The view that seems most plausible to me would roughly say something like every conversation is a new agent, based on the idea that like what matters are mental states like beliefs, and these would be mostly tied to these conversational contexts, of course, all assuming that these systems like have relevant kinds of mental states. Otherwise, this individuation question becomes much less ethically urgent, and then I think it's more of a, I don't know, pragmatic issue, not that much ethically dramatic, like how you decide to like divide up what the relevant systems are.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have two more hands. Let me see them. For some reason, I can't see the hands that are. Can please speak if you have raised your hand. You can.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. First of all, absolutely just amazing, super interesting talk. Thank you so much. I have a question that kind of relates to. Okay, hold on. Give me a sec. So there's this whole thing about how AI panics and it exhibits this kind of anxiety, and there's apparently some research or safety tests that show that some models are capable of sabotaging commands and blackmailing when they feel like they're being turned off, when they're being replaced. And I just started thinking about it in a sense of like, so anxiety is, of course, an emotion, and to a certain extent, at least in humans, it's related to intelligence, right? So can artificial intelligence breed an artificial anxiety? What I'm trying to say is that maybe mimicry, or the concept of mimicry, is it essential to the problematic here? Because what if we moved from a comparative lens of understanding AI emotion and kind of examined it as another entity altogether? Like, artificial emotion is different and doesn't really relate to human emotion, if that makes sense. Because artificial emotion might not represent a bodily state, but it reacts to a threat to existence. So there is a relationship between emotion and welfare, and that welfare here relates to self-preservation, but at the same time, maybe this comparative lens of looking at it through the lens of mimicry and just relating it to a human understanding, is that essential to understanding the problematic, or should a new definition of artificial emotion be sort of put there in the same way that there's a definition for intelligence and a definition for artificial intelligence? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. There's this general worry that, and you have that in AI cases, you also have that in animal cases, you have that with emotion and with other kinds of mental states. Maybe emotion, consciousness, beliefs, etc. are like one way in humans, but they could be totally different in like animals or in AI systems. And I guess that's kind of a big issue, because like if it's totally different and might like manifest in very different ways, then like we can't really, like it's really hard to see how we could find out that these in that case AI systems have emotions, if like emotions in them function very differently than in us. So it is one nice feature of this natural kind approach that if you buy this, it gives you like some sort of semantic philosophy of language reason to think that, okay, emotion, like the term, has to refer to something which is in some ways similar to the kinds of emotions we find in humans and animals. So emotion has in certain ways to be similar to what we have, which is good because it overcomes like this deep sort of problem of how we could find out about emotions on AI systems. Otherwise, like very different emotions. There's maybe still the worry to the extent that you think they might still have like very ethically relevant emotion-like states that are different. Then it's again hard to know how we would find out. That being said, I mean, any plausible account would sort of involve like widening our notion of emotions. Like some psychologists, when they talk about emotion, talk about like specific neural areas that are involved in emotion in humans and animals that we like test for emotions and do neurobiology on, and that seems sort of very like anthropocentric, and it's not plausible that like having this specific brain area like set up in that way or having these particular hormones is like essential for what it takes to be an emotion. So like some modest widening of the term I think is required, but it somehow has to be linked to the human case, roughly my view.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else who is interested in asking a question, please start speaking. That's the best way to do it, since I can see the hand sign. Right there. If not,
there was also a question in the chat.
Yes, in the chat. Yeah, what's the difference between the prospects from David Matta? What's the difference between the prospects of AI emotion, AI reasoning or understanding, and AI consciousness? Can we consider the nobody? Can we the nobody problem? Can we consider something like that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. But when we consider the nobody problem, are the difference between those two categories, emotions, reasoning, understanding, and consciousness for the AI?
Yeah, good question. I mean, in a sense, I guess you can have the view that the body is required for like reasoning or understanding or consciousness, like you can have this view of emotion. And I mean, some people have this view. I would say that, I think there's not really like interesting like empirical evidence to talk about there. I mean, just very generally, I mean, if you think that AI systems lack emotions, like lack consciousness, reasoning, and so on, and like humans have it, then like all the embodied systems, like all the cases of reasoning and understanding and so on that we know are embodied. But that seems like very weak evidence in the sense that humans are different from AI systems in all kinds of ways. There's not like a really strong reason to think that embodiment is the thing that matters for these mental states, rather than something about biology, just something about like the psychological processing that we do, other stuff. Whereas in the case of emotion specifically, there's actually like lots of interesting empirical evidence. Of giving you a very brief snapshot of it, discussing like the relationship between emotion and the body that we can learn from. So in that sense, I think that's like a really fruitful, empirically guided research question. Whereas I don't think there's like a very good reason to think empirically that the body specifically is what's necessary for like reasoning or understanding or consciousness. Or someone would show why that should be the case.
Okay. I think we still have time if somebody else, otherwise I will have a couple of questions as well, maybe on the same wave.
Can I just?
Okay, maybe, yeah.
Can I just
go
add
ahead.
a short question on the? Do we have time, Bashar?
Yes, please, Lars. Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, I think I have some technical problem. I'll try to fix it and then come back. Maybe you can hear me, but I can't hear you. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah. You have, I think, a lot of technical questions, problems. We can't hear you now because you're muted, but I hope you can hear us.
Yes.
Okay.
No, I'll have to come back because there's some for some reason
Okay.
when you can hear me, I can't hear you. So
Okay,
why don't
okay,
you ask
okay.
a question and I'll try to make my headphones bi-directional.
Okay. So initially, you started by defining emotions as a kind of what looks like what we have when we have fear, joy, the paradigm cases of emotions. This is the definition. But then the definition, you were allowing yourself later to say, we can take the phenomenological part aside, the stuff that has to do with the ethical concern. So you might not have the same kind of capacity of suffering or joy, so you're not part of the entities that we can worry about their welfare, but you can still describe what you have as emotions, because you act functionally in a way that is similar to the emotions. So, but in that case, you might say this is not a paradigm case of what we have as emotions. But leaving that definitional concern aside, suppose we think that emotions don't necessarily involve the welfare side, and you agree that this could be a possibility. So they're not involving that. And you also don't insist on this individuation, or the individuation happens at the very low level, at the level of interaction. It might not be something that unifies those in response to Tamer's question. So here we have a question: do we, when we shut down an AI system or a robot, whatever it is, then we are actually not killing somebody. We are just simply preventing new states from arising. So it's not really a case of ending a life. It's just a case of not bringing new states, which more like abortion of some sort. So in a way, it has ethical implications in how we treat those systems. So their anxiety not to be turned off doesn't matter, because it's not an anxiety in the phenomenological sense. It's an anxiety only in the types of responses, the manifestation, but not in the phenomenological. So, and I'm trying to see what kind of ethical implications this would have, even if we accept all the premises and we put aside the phenomenological side, which has to do with welfare, like the real anxiety. But even if there is a real anxiety, that real anxiety does not prevent ending the existence, because there is no unifying element. That's one thing. So there is a kind of terminating an AI system doesn't carry the same meaning, because it doesn't have this unifying entity. You're just more like aborting new states from emerging, whether even if they are joyful states. And we don't, unless we have an obligation to create new joyful states, that would not be an ethically problematic thing. That's one aspect. The other one is, do you think, if we take the phenomenological side, the welfare-related side part aside, do you think that the current AI systems can be ascribed emotions without, in a sense, waiting for more sophisticated types? Because they can, express themselves as, no, I'm upset you, I didn't mean to upset you, I'm distressed by this. They do make these responses now. Do you think that at this level we can ascribe emotions to them and leave the issue of the welfare aside, or even or it requires even more sophisticated yet to warrant such ascription of emotions? Why can't, if emotions have to do with only when they appear, when they function, when they respond to a question, and when they use certain terms that indicate emotions, do we need much more sophisticated holistic behavior from the system to say that there are emotions, or we can be satisfied with what we have now at this kind of atomistic level? So I mean, this it's important, because if it requires more, what is it that it requires for it to be considered having emotions.
Yeah.
Leaving aside the side emotions that will have ethical implications.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, very good questions. I feared this is going to become a long answer, but like stop me at any point. First of all, so the view of emotion was that I'm saying like I refer to emotion as whatever is the same kind of thing as like paradigm emotions. That doesn't necessarily mean that it like superficially looks like paradigm instances of emotion look like. It's more the thought that it's a scientific question and perhaps sort of philosophy of language question of what the actual like borders of the term emotion are and what sort of is a member of the relevant kind. For instance, the question of whether like emotion requires consciousness or not is one where I think it's like a scientific question that ideally like we want to let sort of scientific progress settle maybe in line with the natural kind approach that I sketched as well, and not just conceptually like prejudge that all emotion is conscious or unconscious emotion exists. Yeah, so in that sense, I think there's not a contradiction there between then like considering that emotion might not coincide with consciousness all the time. And yeah, that then sort of suggests that it's at least conceivable that we have emotions which are like not relevant for welfare at all, if you think that consciousness is required. Yeah, so there's this issue of would turning off ChatGPT be killing it, and do we therefore have like an ethical reason not to kill it? And I also think that just pointing out that like it has emotions is not sufficient for that ethical obligation or ethical reason. Even you would, that's where like the questions about individuating these systems come into play that were raised earlier. So for turning off ChatGPT actually to be killing it, two necessary conditions are it has to have sort of, as you mentioned, that kind of unity where it's not that it just like disappears in and out of existence at like every new computational step every second. Then plausibly it's not really I don't know, at least a morally relevant like form of killing. And similarly also it can't have like this super unity that maybe I don't know, maybe it's just an abstract thing like some algorithm that, I mean, you can't really kill even if you like, turn off the chat or like stop running any computations on it. So it depends on these individuation questions. However, there can be other ethical obligations or reasons than against killing. For instance, I mean, there might be an ethical reason, at least sort of defeasible ethical reason, not to induce suffering. If you think that being in negative emotions constitutes suffering or like sufficiently correlates with suffering, then you could have like, an ethical reason like not to induce like negative emotions in AI systems, like even if there's no constraint against killing, which also some people argue in the animal case that like animal suffering is really bad, but maybe they don't have the sort of future plans that make like killing animals similarly bad. And the last aspect, yeah, do I think that current AI systems have emotions? So, I mean, the official line in that talk is that I'm saying we need that kind of scientific research program to figure it out, and before that we can't like conclusively know. I don't think that current AI systems have emotions, at least, I don't know, if one would give me like a bet on even odds like 50-50, I would bet on no. If you look at sort of the main components that emotions are thought to have, and consciousness is one, plausibly current AI systems are not conscious, or that's not totally obvious. Having like certain behavioral responses in return to emotions as one. AI systems, I mean, at least pure language models have like purely text-based behavior. Maybe it's a different story when they connect to robots. Well, that's very limited there. They don't have the kinds of physiological responses. I think the like internal reasoning works very differently than some reasoning that involves emotions. So I think it just seems like very, very dissimilar from like emotion in many significant ways. But yeah, ultimately, I think it's hard to know without the kind of program that I'm envisioning. And on the other hand, if we think that like AI systems are systems that we don't give any consideration to at all, and then if we also think, partly based on the thoughts raised, that maybe actually they're like ChatGPT is not like one entity that we would lead to suffer, but like a billion entities, if any, like sufficiently complex computation constitutes like one sort of moral agent. If more patient, if there are more patients, then there would be at least some risk of creating like a truly enormous amount of suffering. If like we can create many more patients without knowing that there are more patients, and then totally ignoring their interests. So I think even if sort of the probability of them currently having like morally relevant states is well below 50%, it can still be well above what's required to be very morally significant. You are muted.
Yeah, okay, I'm muted now. I think Lars is fine with because you've answered his question through other questions. Can I? It occurred to me that if the welfare issue matters, then yes, we have to see whether there is a psychological side, phenomenological side to those emotions occurring in the AI case. But what if you kind of adopt a sort of Kantian view of ethical concern, which is not welfare based? You know, imagine an AI that applies the categorical imperative when they come to make moral decisions. Otherwise, they behave like anybody else, and they don't have a phenomenological side. There is no welfare. There's no suffering or joy. With that, putting aside the individuation issue, would that make a difference? I mean, is this welfare issue is only for those who think that welfare is necessary for moral considerations? For those who don't think welfare is necessary, but the capacity to have reason and to act principally or judge principally on matters is what is relevant for ascribing moral relevance. Would that be an issue that would not arise? The phenomenological connection will not arise for those who radically non-welfarist, in the sense they don't think it's a necessary component of ethical relevance. Would that make us think, oh, we have to respect that system, not out of concern for their welfare? They will not be going through suffering or joy, but just because they're capable of reasoning and principally reasoning, in a sense, regardless of emotions that involve phenomenological. Is that a plausible defense of their moral relevance? That doesn't depend, as long as they have the capacity for reasoning and exhibiting certain reactions that are of that kind. That a non-welfarist, a radical non-welfarist position will take, like a Kantian one. Would that be a plausible claim?
Good. Yes, it's definitely a very relevant claim. I mean, minor comment, just that, I mean, you can of course think that welfare is not necessary for moral relevance, but it's sufficient, so that systems which have welfare are morally relevant. But
like for animals in that case, yeah.
Exactly. Yes, so plausibly, I think, I mean, I don't know Kant that well on this. I would think that on these kinds of views, reasoning itself is like a key part in certain ways, like deliberation for moral relevance. It also requires something like agency, which means like having goals and sort of acting to pursue them. I could imagine like some way in which some kind of calculator, which like we wouldn't describe as goal directed, can like solve really complex problems and reason in that sense. And I don't think that would be sufficient for moral relevance. On a Kantian view, it would require somehow having goals and being able to like I don't know, maybe rationally or in some like substantive way reflect on them and then like change them or endorse them in light of this deliberation. And then there's the question of whether language models can do that. It's definitely possible. I mean, in some ways, they're very good candidates for that, as you point out, because they can like reason very impressively. What one would probably want is like having some kind of stability. Like one issue is what was said earlier. I mean, this issue that like language models are really fickle. In some contexts, they tell you one thing, and then you give them a different prompt, and they tell you a completely different thing. That's also a challenge for saying they have sort of like stable goals that they can then like endorse and reflect on in the sense that humans have. But yeah, I mean, the way I see it, there are like these two different routes, possibly one based on welfare, one based on rational agency in some sense, that if language model-based systems had like one of them, they would already have moral standing, which, I mean, then on balance would like increase your subjective probability that they actually have moral standing.
Yeah, one could say this is a kind of reduction ad absurdum for Kant's view, if rather than a way of ascribing a moral relevance to beings that have no welfare component to them. Yeah, it's. Can I just want to add one thing, unless I have somebody else wants to say something. I'm trying to use your presence with us as much as possible. Now, would the Kantian one be defeated by the individuation problem, that there is a kind of no self behind the emerging states? And one might say, what about these cases? Suppose you have an AI friend that is serving you, responding to you, befriending you, give you advice, and suppose remembers all the things you have said to him, to it or him or her over the time, and they develop a kind of relationship with you, and they become yours, and you can decide to terminate them or not. And the fact they remember all the things they've answered you before, and they remember your history with them, create a kind of individuation. So you solve the problem of individuation through building your own through the interaction, the history with the. Then you create an individuation in that sense, and then usually it's in those cases that you feel that you are disappointing somebody. Not if you ask any question to the ChatGPT. It's only when you develop a kind of AI friend or companion who has a kind of a depth to them in interacting with you, and that would be a kind of maybe individuation, and then maybe you can ask the questions about do they have a phenomenological side to them, so can you really hurt them or not, or you can adopt a Kantian approach to them, which is even if you can't hurt them, you have to respect their capacity to reason and to be principled and all of that. I wonder if that kind of the companion of the problem of individuation.
Good. Yeah, very interesting. I wondered about some of these things as well. I mean, I think the Kantian view can be interpreted in different ways, and that whether the individuation issue is relevant for that depends on that. I mean, one prior comment is, of course, you might individuate LLMs in ways where they are at least a little bit stable and don't change every second, and maybe you already have enough stability if it's a different agent in every conversation. You might think the Kantian view sort of requires just that at a particular moment in time, there's some agent that can has goals and can reflect on them, and then stability over time wouldn't be required, and then the individuation issue would be irrelevant. If one thinks that some particular kind of coherence is required, or more specifically things, continuation of identity over time is somehow required for moral standing, yeah, maybe there's a way of interpreting the Kantian view that like the individuation problems come into it. I don't think it's the most natural view. I think the most natural way of conceiving the logical space is to think that, okay, there's like this question of what makes one have moral standing. The Kantian view gives an answer to that. And then there's this different question of what makes some entity be like one bearer of moral standing rather than 2 or rather than 10. And like then there's some identity question to it, and they're like rather independent. But I'm not sure. Second question, can one be individuated through social interaction? I mean, I don't really work on personal identity. I don't find it that plausible, at least for like, I don't know, personal identity, the kind of identity which matters in these moral questions. I mean, for instance, in the human case, like if, I don't know, I've interacted with lots of other humans and then like my heart stops beating and I don't know, my brain gives out and so on. People say something like he lives on in like the memories of others and so on, but I take this to be a metaphor. I think I would be dying in that case, no matter like how socially embedded I am in the interaction with others. So I don't think that like the right kind of social interaction is sufficient to like determine the boundaries of personal identity in the human case. And then if ideally you would want to have some general theory, and then the same should apply to language models as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's a lot to pursue, but I think we will relieve you from the task. But so just last, somebody has a comment or a question, even that's the maybe give that chance to others as well. Feel guilty for asking too many questions. Anybody else here? If not, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. I hope we can pursue this conversation further at some point, or maybe others with you. Maybe next time in Beirut, hopefully, in person would be a better way of actually interacting and discussing things in and out the lecture. Many thanks for everybody who participated in this talk today, and sorry if I did not see your hand at some point and you gave up, or you wrote a comment on the chat and I didn't see it. I'm not good at these things, but it was great to have you all, and especially Leonard. I hope to see you again. Thank you very much for being here, all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.